You think going silent after an argument makes you look strong, like you're staying in control, like you're protecting your value. Maybe part of you even believes that if you pull away long enough, she'll come back softer, more emotional, more invested in keeping the relationship together. But let me ask you something. If silence really created attraction, why do so many relationships slowly fall apart after it? Because what feels like power to you often feels like emotional rejection to her, and rejection doesn't create deeper love. It quietly damages trust. At first, she reaches out, she texts more, she asks what's wrong, and in your mind, that feels like proof the strategy is working. But look deeper. She's not moving closer because her attraction suddenly increased. She's reacting to uncertainty. Her emotional system is trying to restore stability. And the dangerous part is this: by the time you notice the distance growing between you, she's already started emotionally detaching. That's how most relationships break down. Not through one explosive argument, but through repeated moments of emotional withdrawal that slowly kill safety, connection, and desire. So if you've ever used silence after conflict, believing it made you look stronger or more valuable, you need to understand what it's actually doing behind the scenes. Because silence doesn't just change the argument, eventually it changes the relationship itself.
A lot of men operate with one hidden belief in relationships, even if they never say it out loud. Whoever cares less has the power. So after an argument, they pull back. They become colder, quieter, more distant. They stop replying quickly. Sometimes they disappear completely. And when the woman starts reaching out more, asking questions, trying to reconnect, it feels like proof that the strategy is working. But most men misunderstand what they're actually seeing. She's not chasing because her attraction suddenly increased. She's reacting because something emotionally changed and her mind is trying to restore balance. The tension, the uncertainty, the sudden distance, it creates anxiety, and anxiety can temporarily increase pursuit. But anxiety is not attraction. Real attraction grows through emotional safety, trust, consistency, and connection. Uncertainty might create urgency for a moment, but over time it slowly damages the emotional foundation the relationship depends on. This is where many men confuse emotional instability with emotional power. They think silence makes them look mysterious. In reality, it often makes them look emotionally unpredictable. And unpredictability doesn't strengthen attraction long term, it weakens trust. Imagine this clearly. You go silent after conflict. She sees you online, active, laughing with other people, posting stories, responding everywhere except to her. In your mind, you're holding your ground. In her mind, the relationship suddenly feels emotionally unsafe. That moment matters more than most men realize. Because once someone starts associating you with confusion instead of clarity, emotional closeness slowly begins disappearing. And when trust starts fading, attraction eventually follows behind it. Now, to really understand this pattern, you have to understand something important. Most men are not going silent because they're evil, manipulative, or calculating every move. Most of the time, they're reacting emotionally without fully understanding what's driving the behavior. The first reason is emotional overload. During conflict, a man's nervous system can become flooded with frustration, pressure, anger, or confusion. In that moment, silence feels safer than speaking impulsively and making the situation worse. So instead of communicating clearly, he shuts down emotionally. The second reason is control. A lot of men secretly believe distance creates leverage. If they pull away first, they won't feel weak, vulnerable, or emotionally exposed. Silence becomes a way to regain a sense of power during emotional tension. Third is avoiding accountability, because as long as you stay silent, you don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to admit fault. You don't have to face uncomfortable conversations or difficult emotions. Silence becomes a shield from responsibility. Fourth is conditioning. Many men grew up in environments where conflict was never handled through healthy communication. Problems were avoided, emotions were suppressed, and people emotionally withdrew instead of resolving issues. Without realizing it, they repeat the same patterns in adulthood. And finally, fear. Sometimes silence is not about control at all, it's about self protection. If you don't engage emotionally, you can't be rejected. If you don't open up, you can't be misunderstood. Silence temporarily protects the ego from discomfort. But here's the problem: what protects you in the short term can slowly destroy the relationship in the long term. Because while you believe you're calming yourself down, her mind is already trying to understand why the emotional connection suddenly disappeared. And that's where the real damage quietly begins.
This is the part most men never fully understand. When you suddenly go silent after conflict, you think you're creating space. But inside her mind, something very different starts happening. Her brain begins searching for answers. What changed? Did I push him away? Is he losing interest? Is this the beginning of emotional distance? Is the relationship becoming unstable? And the longer the silence continues without clarity, the louder those questions become. Human beings are emotionally wired to seek security in close relationships. When communication suddenly disappears, the nervous system reacts to uncertainty almost like a threat. That's why silence after conflict often creates anxiety instead of peace. You may believe she's overthinking, but from her perspective, the emotional connection suddenly feels unpredictable. And emotional unpredictability slowly damages emotional safety. At first, she tries to reconnect. She texts, she checks your activity. She replays the argument in her mind, searching for what went wrong. But over time, something starts shifting internally. The confusion slowly turns into emotional caution. She becomes more guarded with her emotions, less expressive, less vulnerable. She starts holding parts of herself back because she no longer feels secure enough to stay emotionally open, and this is where attraction quietly begins fading. Because emotional safety is one of the deepest foundations of long-term connection. When a woman consistently feels emotionally disconnected during difficult moments, her nervous system slowly starts associating the relationship with stress instead of comfort. That changes everything. You think you're protecting the relationship by avoiding conflict temporarily. But from her perspective, the relationship already feels emotionally damaged the moment the connection disappears without explanation. And here's the dangerous part most men never notice. Women often do not emotionally detach suddenly. They detach gradually. First, they stop explaining themselves. Then, they stop expressing vulnerability. Then, they stop expecting emotional support from you at all. And once emotional safety disappears consistently, attraction does not usually grow stronger. It slowly starts disappearing beside it. Not all silence is unhealthy, and this is where many men become confused. Sometimes space is necessary, sometimes stepping away briefly can actually protect the relationship. But the problem is that most men don't realize when healthy space slowly turns into emotional punishment. There are 3 levels to this. Level 1, healthy space. This is emotionally mature distance. You feel overwhelmed, frustrated, or emotionally heated, so you communicate clearly before stepping away. You say something simple like, "I'm upset right now. I need a little time to calm down, but we'll talk later." That small amount of clarity changes everything. She understands what's happening. She knows the connection is still intact. There's reassurance, direction, and emotional stability. This type of silence protects the relationship because it creates temporary space without emotional abandonment. Level 2, emotional withdrawal. This is where things start becoming dangerous. You don't completely disappear, but your energy changes. Your replies become slower, colder, shorter. You stop engaging emotionally, but you also don't explain why. Now she feels the distance, but she doesn't understand it. And uncertainty is where anxiety begins growing. This is the gray zone most men stay in far too long. They tell themselves they're simply cooling off, but emotionally, the relationship already feels tense and disconnected. Level 3, silence as punishment. This is where silence becomes toxic. You intentionally ignore messages. You stay active online while refusing to respond. Part of you wants her to feel anxious, guilty, or desperate enough to chase you first. At this point, silence is no longer about emotional regulation. It becomes emotional control, and women can feel the difference. Because healthy space says, I need a moment, but I still care about us. Punishing silence says, you don't get emotional access to me until I feel satisfied again. And once silence becomes a weapon instead of communication, trust slowly starts breaking underneath the relationship.
Here's something many men fail to understand. Silence does not hide your emotions, it reveals them. Because even when you stop speaking, your behavior continues communicating for you. And women pay attention to those behavioral shifts far more than most men realize. She notices when you open her message but leave it unanswered for hours. She notices when you're active online, responding to other people while ignoring her completely. She notices when your replies suddenly become cold, dry, or emotionally distant. Even small changes communicate something powerful. One word answers, avoiding eye contact, emotionally checking out during conversations, acting physically present but mentally disconnected. All of these behaviors send a message even when no words are spoken, and the message usually feels much louder emotionally than men intend. You may believe you're simply calming yourself down or avoiding unnecessary conflict. But when multiple withdrawal behaviors happen together, the emotional meaning becomes very clear to her. She no longer feels connected to you. She feels shut out by you. And there's an important difference between needing space and emotionally withholding yourself. Healthy space says, I need time, but I'm still emotionally here. Emotional withholding says, you lose access to me when conflict happens. That distinction matters deeply because over time, women stop reacting mainly to your words. They start reacting to your emotional patterns. And if your pattern during tension is withdrawal, distance, and emotional unavailability, she slowly begins associating you with emotional instability instead of emotional security. That's why silence becomes dangerous. Not because you stop talking, but because your behavior silently communicates rejection, disconnection, and emotional unpredictability long before you ever say another word. One of the biggest mistakes men make is believing silence only affects the relationship in the moment. It doesn't. Silence creates emotional damage in stages. And the longer it continues without clarity, the deeper the emotional disconnection becomes. The first few hours. If communication is clear, nothing major breaks. You say, I need some time to calm down. We'll talk later. That creates emotional stability. The relationship still feels secure because she understands what's happening. Temporary space with reassurance is healthy. Around 2 to 12 hours. Now uncertainty starts growing. Her mind begins replaying the argument, analyzing your tone, your words, your behavior. She starts wondering whether you're emotionally pulling away or losing interest. This is where anxiety quietly enters the relationship. Between 12 and 24 hours, the emotional tone changes completely. What started as confusion slowly turns into frustration, hurt, or self-blame. Attraction already starts weakening because emotional tension is replacing emotional safety. She may still reach out, but internally, emotional exhaustion is beginning. After 24 hours and repeated patterns, this is where real damage begins forming. Trust takes a hit, not because of one argument, but because your silence starts becoming part of your emotional pattern. And once someone expects emotional withdrawal every time conflict appears, the relationship stops feeling safe. So she adapts. She becomes less emotionally dependent, less expressive, less vulnerable, eventually less invested. And this is the dangerous part most men never see coming. You think you're teaching her to respect your distance. In reality, you're slowly teaching her how to emotionally detach from you. And once emotional detachment becomes the new normal, attraction rarely survives for long.
The real danger of silence is not what happens during one argument. It's what repeated emotional withdrawal slowly turns the relationship into overtime. At first, the damage is subtle, almost invisible, but layer by layer, the emotional connection starts weakening beneath the surface. 1. Resentment begins. Building. every unresolved conflict leaves emotional residue behind. When problems never get discussed properly, frustration doesn't disappear, it gets stored. Over time, both people stop feeling emotionally heard, and eventually, even small disagreements start carrying the weight of old unresolved pain. 2. Emotional intimacy starts shrinking. The deep conversations slowly disappear. She shares less. You engage less. The emotional openness that once created closeness begins fading. Eventually, the relationship becomes functional instead of emotionally connected. You talk about schedules, responsibilities, and surface level topics, but the emotional depth that once created intimacy slowly dies. 3. Avoidance becomes the relationship culture. Both people start walking on emotional eggshells. Instead of addressing problems early, you both begin avoiding difficult conversations entirely because conflict now feels emotionally unsafe. The relationship may appear calm externally, but internally, unresolved tension continues growing. 4. Emotional connection starts happening elsewhere. This is where relationships often begin drifting apart emotionally. When someone no longer feels emotionally safe expressing themselves with their partner, they naturally seek emotional comfort somewhere else. Sometimes it's a friend, sometimes a coworker, sometimes simply another person who listens without shutting down emotionally. An emotional disconnection inside a relationship often creates emotional connection outside of it. 5. Trust slowly collapses. Trust rarely breaks in one dramatic moment. It weakens through repeated emotional inconsistency. When your partner never knows whether you'll communicate or emotionally disappear during difficult moments, emotional security slowly fades away. And here's the painful truth most men realize too late. She usually doesn't leave suddenly. She emotionally disconnects slowly, while the silence continues building between both of you.
Target word count 220, 260 words. Here's the part most men never think about. Silence doesn't only damage the relationship. Eventually, it starts changing you too. Because every time you emotionally withdraw and she begins chasing, apologizing, or trying harder to reconnect, your brain receives a dangerous kind of validation. You start feeling powerful when she feels anxious, and over time, that slowly changes the way you experience connection itself. Instead of feeling attracted to emotional stability, peace, and closeness, you begin associating emotional intensity with love. Calm connection starts feeling boring, healthy communication feels weak, and emotional chaos becomes the thing that makes you feel desired. That's where the pattern becomes emotionally addictive. You stop craving genuine intimacy and start craving emotional control. You feel most important when she's worried about losing you, most desired when she's emotionally unsettled, but that isn't real emotional strength. It's dependence on emotional imbalance. And the more easily you can trigger anxiety and distance inside the relationship, the harder it becomes to truly respect the connection itself. Because deep down, you know the dynamic is built on emotional instability instead of trust. Eventually, something strange happens. She chases harder, while you slowly lose emotional attraction toward her at the same time. Because control may feed the ego temporarily, but it slowly destroys emotional respect underneath the relationship. And this is the truth many men avoid facing. If someone has to feel emotionally anxious for you to feel emotionally wanted, the relationship is already becoming unhealthy.